asking Hamas to do something nice, asking Hamas to compromise is not a very straightforward thing. You know, Sinwar himself, who planned and plotted the 7th of October, is an utter fanatic. And this is something, by the way, that we in the West have sort of forgotten about. We use the term fanatical to describe anyone about their football team as a supporter and so on. But a real fanatic, somebody willing to kill and die and doesn't care about that. And Sinwar, everything we know about him is that he is precisely of that type. We know that, there's an account in the New York Times last year of the Israeli doctor who saved Sinwar's life when he was in prison in Israel some 13 years ago or so now. His life was saved by an Israeli doctor. And Sinwar said to this doctor, he thanked him for saving his life, but he said to him, you know, one day, he said, currently you're strong, but one day you'll be weak and then I'll attack. You know, one of the young people murdered by Sinwar and his forces on the 7th was the nephew of the doctor who saved his life. This is Sinwar. This is Hamas. You could literally save the life of Sinwar and he'll still come back to kill you. Tell me that such a person is a reasonable negotiating partner.
Well,
in my view, it is not Netanyahu who's uncompromising. It's Hamas that's uncompromising. They could have handed back the hostages last October. They could have not done this. I mean, they could have tried to build a state since 2005 when Israel withdrew from the Gaza and handed the place over to them. Hamas could have used the billions of dollars and pounds and euros that British and European and American taxpayers gave them since 2006. They could have used those billions of dollars to build up Gaza. They could have made a booming, in the good sense of the term, Mediterranean paradise. They could have created wealth for their people. But you know what they did? They built down instead of upwards. They built a tunnel network bigger than the London Underground for all of those years, and they squirreled away the money, just like Yasser Arafat did before them, and they made themselves rich. Why was Ismail Haniyeh worth billions of dollars? Why does Khaled Mashal, why is he worth billions of dollars? Why are their children like princelings who live in apartment complexes in Doha? Because they took the money of Americans and Brits and Europeans and they took it for themselves and kept the people of Gaza in immiseration and poverty. There has been since 2005 a complete counterfactual of what could have happened. But the Hamas leadership didn't want that. They have said themselves they want to use Palestinian children and their lives in order to pressurize the world. These are fanatics. They want the death of their own citizens, in order to get world opinion turned against Israel. Again, how do you negotiate with that? The assumption always is in the West today, because we're so sort of fat and lazy in our expectation that peace is the norm, and that historically it's the norm. We're so full of our own expectations and presumptions that we always think that wars end by some kind of compromise and coming around the table, to use the cliche. They don't. Historically, most wars end because one side wins and one side loses. And one of the reasons, in my view, why there is this endless rounds of war in this region is because the Israelis are never allowed to win, and Hamas, in this case, are always allowed to draw. And I think that is simply to set up the precursor for the next conflict. If Hamas come out of this with a fighting capability, then there will be another round of this war in a couple of years. So when David Lammy and others say what we need to have is a peace deal, I'd say on what terms? Everybody wants peace except for Hamas and the fanatics. Everybody else wants peace. All of these people in the south, these kibbutzniks and the party goers and others who were murdered on the 7th, all dreamed of peace with their Palestinian neighbors and brothers and sisters. Who stopped that peace being possible? Hamas, from 2005 and again to this very day.
I want to play you a clip. This is from an Israeli podcast with Elon Levy that you did in March about well, you seem to infer something about all Palestinians being complicit. I want to play the clip and then get your response to it.
I treat the Palestinians in Gaza in the same way I would treat any other group that produced a horror like that. They're responsible for their actions. They're responsible for their actions. They voted in Hamas knowing what Hamas are. They allowed Hamas to carry out the coup, killing Fatah and other Palestinians and dragging their bodies behind trucks in the West Bank, in Gaza.
Do you actually hold all Palestinians culpable then for what Hamas have done?
Well, all Palestinians aren't, as it were, free game just because of this. No, not at all. Of course not. And all their lives matter. The point I made there, and the point I've made for many years now, is that you cannot separate out completely the Palestinian people and their leadership. The leadership is there for a reason. They get elected, albeit they tend to have one election once and then just stay in power, as is the case with the PA in the West Bank, and as is the case with Gaza in Gaza with Hamas. I've had many conversations with many Palestinians over many years now, in which they have tried to say, well, look, you know, we don't like our leadership, or our leadership isn't good, but you know. The thing is, Piers, is that if you have a vote, for instance, and you vote for Hamas, then there are consequences to that. And for all of these years, Hamas has been ruling the Gaza. It would obviously be much better for the Palestinian people if they had not voted in a genocidal terrorist group as their government.
But there is a but. There's a but, Douglas. There's a but. And it says the majority of Palestinians actually did not vote for Hamas. They got 44% of the vote. So it's not true to say that the majority of Palestinians, or all of them, voted for this. They didn't. You know, more than half of Gaza, of the Palestinian people there, voted against these people. And you could also say that many others who voted for them might well have done because they were terrorized into doing so. And I just think that we've got to be careful, haven't we, about distinguishing between people who genuinely, vocally support Hamas and people who are either terrorized into doing so or who actually voted against them and have then seen their country dragged into an abyss. And I completely agree with you about everything you say about Hamas, and that absolutely no way can they have any power coming out of this. But to blame all Palestinian people, I think, is a big stretch.
I don't blame all Palestinian people by any means. But look, Piers, if you just take the situation in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank, Mahmoud Abbas is, I think, famously, as the joke goes, something like 18 years into his first 4-year term in office, leading the Palestinian Authority. And he's the guy, by the way, who David Lammy and others see as being the more viable negotiating partner. This man is less bad than Hamas, but so far away from being a good negotiating partner that, again, a deal that's been on the table for years, almost literally since 1948, he still can't come to the table on. This is the situation in the West Bank. I remember years ago, I was staying in Ramallah, and I was having meetings with young Palestinians and others, and they kept coming back to the same thing, which is, yes, these people are in power, but there's nothing we can do about it. And I remember once saying to one, you know, the problem is, whether it's Hamas in Gaza or the PA in the West Bank, all peoples who have been governed by terror entities like this are, of course, always themselves at risk. But the history of human liberation, apart from anything else, has always been people standing up to the tyrants who would rule over them and govern them. So when Hamas seizes control of the Gaza after the election and kills the members of Fatah and others, they then make a deal with Fatah shortly afterwards, and then another one. So where is, you know, the fine art of this, Piers, is to find the very obvious blue water between Fatah and Hamas, but they keep on destroying that clear blue water and making it very murky indeed. Or the leadership of Fatah, what they actually want. And you see again and again, it is not about a settlement dispute on a hill somewhere in Samaria. It's about whether or not Israel has the right to exist from 1948 to this day or not. It isn't. Every single statement, and I can't stress this enough, from the Palestinian Authority of Fatah as well as Hamas, is that the Jews should be out of Haifa, that the Zionists should be out of Tel Aviv, that the Israelis must not be in Jerusalem. You see that they don't want an inch of this ground in this area to be governed by Israel and for Jews to be able to live in it. I wish that these people who have come to this mad situation, if they cared about their own people, an insane situation. I wish that that their forebears in 1948 had accepted the offer to have a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli state. I wish that at every point since, when a deal could have been made, whether it was at Camp David or many times since, I wish the Palestinian leadership had cared enough for the Palestinian people that they had accepted the offers on the table. But again and again since 1948, they have said, no, we will sit this out, and one day the Israelis will disappear, and that's what we're holding out for. And that is the worst possible thing that they could have said to the Palestinian people, wherever they are, inside Israel, in the disputed areas, or in Gaza. The worst thing they have said to now several generations of Palestinians is, we will not accept 99% of a state if there is a Jewish state. That is the reason there is not peace today. That is the reason there is not a final status settlement agreement. It could have been there for decades, just like the Gaza. This could have been so different, and the responsibility for that, in my mind, does not sit on one Israeli prime minister or another, or a dispute in a war cabinet. It is on the fundamental inability and reluctance of the Palestinian leadership since 1948 and before to just accept that the Jews have the right to exist in their historic homeland and have a state which they can defend. And whether it's Mahmoud Abbas or Yahya Sinwar, they have spent all of these decades misleading their own people and leading them into precisely the situation of immiseration and now the horrors of Gaza that we see today. It is on that leadership and their failure of leadership, and it's a tragedy. One of the things that democracies have to be aware of when they're dealing with death cults like Hamas is the death cults operate by a totally different standard than the standards of the democracies. All of the difference in the world exists in that gap.
Final question about Israel before we move on to other topics. How does this end? You know, I've had guests on, pro-Israeli guests, who say this ends effectively with Israel controlling Gaza as an occupying force. You know, Netanyahu has hinted at that. But that, of course, is completely unconscionable and unacceptable to any Palestinian. So how does this end?
Well, I mean, your guess is as good as mine, Piers. The stated objectives of Israel's war, as I say, to return the hostages and to destroy Hamas, which is, as I understand it, is to make sure that Hamas is operationally incapable. And by the way, they've had a very considerable success in that, not just of killing the leadership of Hamas, but among other things, also stopping the perpetual rocket fire, which has gone on for years from Hamas around Gaza into Israel. As the months have gone on since last October, instead of the daily air raid sirens that used to go on in major cities like Tel Aviv, there's now almost no rocket fire out of Gaza because Hamas has been made so operationally incapable. That's a point that very rarely gets brought out. It's not a small thing to stop rocket fire happening all the time against the civilian population. But as for how it ends, I don't see any appetite in Israel among almost any politicians or the public to have to continue or have to reoccupy Gaza. I don't know of any Israeli who is desperate to be in charge of making sure that Gaza is on a day-to-day basis running well and peaceably. It has been such a hell for such a long time. Whatever you think of Ariel Sharon's pullout in 2005, most people would look back at it now and say, look, the Israelis didn't want to have to be in control of the Gaza then. It was a perpetual nightmare. They withdrew, a new nightmare began. what the final agreement can be on the day after Hamas, it'll probably be, it should be, in my view, some kind of international effort, the basis of which you can kind of see, I think, some of the Gulf states, obviously not the terrorist sponsors in Qatar, but some of the Gulf states, the Emiratis and others have expressed an interest in being involved in some way. The Saudis will probably have to be involved, the Egyptians, the Jordanians. Maybe all of these people who express concern about the Palestinian peoples and who've done so little for them for so many decades could actually do something about that concern. Put money in, help with a peacekeeping force, help with a police force, and much more. The one thing that cannot happen is that Gaza is built back up under Hamas, and we have the same war in the same region a few years down the road. And so what it looks like the day after, I don't know. But, that's the thing about wars. If you start a war, as Hamas did on the 7th, you don't know how it's going to end. The one thing that Israel knows is what is impossible to tolerate. And what is impossible to tolerate is a situation where Hamas has control of the Gaza again and continues to fire rockets again and then does October the 7th again and again, as its leadership have said they wanted to do.
On that, I completely agree with you.